going to talk about amplifiers. Now, because this series that I'm doing is designed for people who haven't played in a band before and don't have the experience and perhaps the full range of equipment, the assumption that I'm making is that you don't have a great big, very expensive, all bells and whistles amplifier at this moment. You've got your guitar, you've got your practice amp that you use for your practice, and that's where we are at the minute. You've been learning, you've been using your practice amp to learn, and that's fine. It's served you well up until this point, and as is the nature of the name of this series, you want to start getting involved in a band. So if you've already got the gear, loads of equipment, amplifiers, you probably won't learn that much from this video, but if you haven't, then maybe there's something useful for you here. I'm going to look at 3 points specifically in order of what I think are the most important. They're going to be the power of amplifiers, features on amplifiers that might be useful when you start playing with a band, and also what I would call the different sound or the different flavours of different brands of amplifiers. And on top of those 3 things, I'm going to finish off with a final point about a slightly different way of approaching this problem. So there's going to be quite a bit in this one. Now, so I'm going to start off with talking about the power of amplifiers. We're assuming you've got your practice amplifier. I don't have a big amplifier at the minute. I've had quite a few in the past, but at the minute I don't. I've got 3 practice amps at the minute. One that I use here, 15 watt Vox practice amp, and I've got 2 Blackstar 10 watt practice amps over at my the place where I do my teaching and my lessons. So that's all I'm using at the minute, and that's perfectly fine for what I'm using it for. Everything you've heard me play, if you've seen my other videos on this channel, has been through one of those amps, nothing more than that. Now the thing with the practice amps is the name, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's designed for you to practice and to be able to hear yourself. Usually they are, as I've mentioned, my amps 15 watt, 10 watt, sometimes 20 watt. In terms of power output, that's how you measure the power, is watts in an amplifier. I would probably say that those type of size of amps are not going to be enough for most people when you start playing with a band. So if that's what you've got at the minute, you're probably going to have to think about getting a little bit more of a powerful amplifier when you start playing with a band. How much power you need, it's going to vary depending on a few different factors which I'm going to talk about, but the chances are, as I found out in my first band, I was really lucky. I had a 30 watt practice amp, which was massive for a practice amp. Too loud. I couldn't turn it up at home, it was too loud to practice. I was a teenager, the mum and dad's, and and the neighbours wouldn't tolerate it, so it felt really loud. But the first time I went to go and play with a band, they couldn't even hear what I was playing, it just wasn't loud enough. So in terms of the power of the amp, it's going to vary. As I say, one of the key factor is going to be what other instruments are in the band and what type of band it is. So that's going to give you an indication of how much power you're going to need. In my circumstances, I was playing in rock and metal bands, and it was always with a drummer that used an acoustic, typical drum kit. Now the thing with the drum kit is, you can't turn it down. With your guitar, as you know, you can turn it as quiet or as loud as your amp will let you do. And it's going to be the same with the keyboard, with a bass guitar, with any electronic instrument. You've got control over the volume of it. If you're playing with a drummer with an acoustic drum kit, then that cannot be turned down. Some drummers play harder than others, how hard they hit the drums, so that'll vary, maybe 20 or 30% difference. But the big thing that, from my experience with playing with a drummer, is it's not so much the drums but the cymbals, because they have to hit them a certain way for them to sound right, and they are a lot of times in the same sound frequency as where the guitar is playing. So if you're not loud enough, your guitar is just not going to get heard. So if you're playing with an acoustic drum kit, then you're going to need certainly more than a practice amp. If you haven't got a drummer, if you're just a couple of guitar players and maybe a singer in like a folk group or something like that, then you might get away with a practice amp. But just think about what other instruments are taking part in your band, because you're going to have to at least be as loud as the loudest acoustic instrument in there. Another thing on that note is how many people, how many members are in your band. I'll say if it's just two of you playing guitar, maybe just two of you playing acoustic guitar, and one of you you're singing like a folky sort of group, Simon and Garfunkel type thing. You don't have to be that loud at all, so you don't have that to worry about. In a lot of my experience, I've been playing with a 5-piece band, so there's been myself playing guitar, there's been another guitar player, a bass guitar player, a drummer and a singer. So all that noise means that you need to have a certain level of power, amplification, to be able to be heard. And if you can't be heard, there's no point doing it, because for one, you won't be able to hear what you're doing, so that'll put you off, because it will sound like your amplifier's been unplugged. And secondly, the rest of the band members won't be able to hear what you're doing, which might put them off. So you need to have enough level to be able to make it work. As I say, different styles of music, whether you play folk, whether you play metal, that'll affect how much volume that you want to be using. Now, when you're looking at these larger amplifiers, I've done a series on practice amplifiers before, so check that out on the channel. And I did briefly mention slightly larger amplifiers, but another thing to bear in mind is that when I'm talking about power, I've mentioned 10 watts, 15 watts, 20 watts, 100 watts, 1000 watts. Different brands of equipment, just because they are the same power, might be louder than others. So amplifier brand A, 50 watts, amplifier brand B, 50 watts. One might be louder than the other. Just like when you buy some shoes, a different brand of shoes, a size 8 or a size 9 might be slightly larger than another different brand. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Don't just look at the number. Have a look at some reviews and things like that, and see how they fare up and what other people are saying about them when you're coming to think about buying a larger amplifier, because they do sound different, and the way that the perceived sound level of them is different depending on the different make of them. On a similar kind of vein to that, there's two different types of amps mainly that you will come across as a guitar player. You've got valve amplifiers and transistor amplifiers, or sometimes they're called valves, are sometimes called tube, transistors are sometimes called solid state. But those are the two different main types of amplifiers that you're going to come across. Now, valve amplifiers, in my experience, and I've owned a few, and I've owned a few of the other transistor solid states as well, the valve amplifiers have always been louder than the transistor ones for the same volume rating. So if I've had a 100 watt valve amp, they've always been louder than a 100 watt transistor amp. It's quite a technical issue in terms of how the amplifiers work. Now's not the time to get into those. That's something to bear in mind. Also, valve amps are a lot more expensive than transistor amps. Normally you'd be looking at least double the price. So that's another thing to bear in mind. They do sound better. There's no way around that. They do definitely sound better, but they're very expensive, and you will find it cheaper to buy a transistor amplifier to be loud enough than a valve amplifier, especially if you're just starting out and you don't want to spend, I mean, I don't know what the cheapest valve amps are nowadays, but I imagine you're looking at 500 or 600 quid for the very cheapest one off the top of my head. So there's a lot of variables there, so that's where you need to do your homework and look at the reviews and see how they actually stack up, because I've not played every amplifier. I've played a few, but I can't give you a graph and show you every single individual one, but that's something to bear in mind. that doesn't answer your question as to which amp to buy, if anyone was thinking of that question, but what I can do is tell you my own experience. I don't have a large amplifier at the minute. As I've said, I've got those little practice amps that work fine for me, for my practice, my teaching. If I was to go and play with a band next week and I needed to go and rehearse and play gigs, playing the same sort of music that I used to play, the rock and the metal and the heavy stuff, and I needed to get an amplifier, my choice would be, if I was to buy a valve amplifier, if I could afford it, I'd be happy with 50 watts of power on a valve amplifier. I know that would be sufficient for me. If I couldn't afford that, if I wanted a transistor amplifier to play the same music with the same band, I'd be looking to get probably 100 watts of power to be able to, for the amp to be able to do what I want it to do. So these little differences we need to bear in mind. Aside from the power of the amplifier, that's just a number. I've given you the sort of numbers that I would probably gravitate towards. You've also got to think about the physical size of the amplifier and the speakers that are in it as well. With the practice amplifiers that I've been using, from the top of my head, I think the Vox amp that I use mainly for these videos has got an 8-inch speaker, just one of those. And the Black Star, I think they're the same, or 6-inch speakers even, so they're quite small speakers. If I was choosing an amplifier to play with a band and play live myself, I would want at least one 12-inch speaker in that amplifier, because it gives you a better push of the low end tones of the sound, and it helps the sound of your playing to be able to carry more. Little speakers are great and the technology's come on brilliant, but at the end of the day, the 12-inch size is a classic speaker size for guitar amplifiers. Normally they start off with a 12-inch speaker. You can get an amplifier that's more of a rectangle shape with two 12-inch speakers. In an ideal world, that's probably what I would choose, because the two speakers give you the option of being able to use stereo effects. I'll talk about effects afterwards, but it also gives you a better sort of push of the sound outwards. You want to go the whole hog, you can get speaker cabinets with 4 12-inch speakers in, which sound absolutely fantastic. I've owned a few different brands of those in the past. Sound and power wise, certainly for metal and heavy music, you can't beat those. They are brilliant. But in terms of the physical size of the amp, the other thing to bear in mind is you need to carry that amplifier. So you're going to be taking that thing from your home to rehearsal, to gigs, in your car, or if you don't have a car, it's even more unlucky, you're taking it in a taxi or in a bus or something like that. You wouldn't be able to take a 4 by 12-inch speaker cabinet, so be realistic about what you're going to be able to carry and how heavy it's going to be, because when I was a teenager, early 20s, I was quite happy lugging these big things around, and I loved the look of them. They look fantastic, and I wanted to look like a big guitar player. Now I'm a lot older, I don't want to carry that sort of stuff around anymore. So don't get more than what you actually need to be able to play with. So that's your basics, power and size of your amplifier. Second to that, the next point is what features might be useful on your amplifier. And when I say what features, your practice amp has probably got a lot of features on these days, because the technology is great. You've got different sounds you can have, different effects you can have. You can change between different sounds, set it up. Most amplifiers nowadays, you can press little buttons and immediately you can store one sound, store a different sound, so you can have a clean sound just to strum along with your chords. Press a button, dirty sound, you can play some heavy metal. Press another button, you can have effects on it, so you can play solos or parts of the song that require your effects, like your reverb, your delay, your chorus. Those are available on practice amps. If you need those type of things, you'll probably find that they're also available on the bigger amps, maybe even more of them. But also bear in mind, when we're talking about these features, changing your different sounds, changing your effects and things, it's a very different scenario practicing than playing these songs in entirety live with a band, and that's where the key feature of a larger amp or a band practice gigging amp comes in, which is the option or the feature of being able to use a foot switch to change the sounds and the settings on the amp. When I'm practicing, I've got my amp beside me there. If I want to play a clean sound, I can press the button and I can strum along and play a clean sound, and I can practice that. I want to play a thrash, metal, heaviest sound I've got, I can press a button, I can switch that sound on. I want to play a guitar solo, I want a bit of chorus, reverb, maybe a little bit of delay, I can press a button, I can switch that on. When you're playing the song with a band and you're playing the song from start to finish, you can't stop playing and reach over and press a button. So you need a foot switch to be able to do that if your music requires you to do that. A lot of music doesn't. I've been in bands where I've not had to change sounds. Where I've not. When I first started, I wasn't playing solos. I wasn't good enough, so I was just playing the distorted heavy guitar parts. I didn't need to change my sound, so I didn't need a foot switch. I just set my sound, and that was fine. A lot of bands, you don't need to do that. But if you're going to have to do that, you're going to have to find a way to do that. So you'll need a way of switching that. So being able to have that option of doing it on the amplifier is a great thing to have, even if you don't use it in your first band, to be able to at least know that you've got the option. You might not be in that band for long, you might not like it, you might get fired, you might decide to choose a different band, and your skills might get better, you might learn to play solos, you might need that. So it's worth bearing in mind. Foot switching on an amplifier is something that's super useful. The third thing, just in terms of amplifiers that I mentioned, I did say 3 things, is that different amps from different companies, different manufacturers, tend to have what I call different flavours, so a different sound to them. Now, going back, we talked about the practice amps. The amp that I've got beside me, I can make it sound almost like lots of different types of amplifiers. So I can make it sound like a clean acoustic guitar amplifier that's doing nothing but making the sound louder. I can make it sound a little bit like a Fender amplifier, which gives you a sort of a clean electric guitar, nice sound with loads of headroom, and it's really great for strumming chords. I can make it sound like a Marshall, which is your standard hard rock, heavy metal sound, classic from the British sort of like 70s, 80s. That's your Marshall sound. If I want it to sound a bit heavier, I can make it sound a little bit like a Mesa Boogie or an Engel, or these high gain rectifier style amplifiers. I can do that. It's not going to sound perfectly like that amplifier, but it's going to sound usable enough for me to be able to practice the parts. When you get a bigger amplifier, a lot of the times they will have their own character. So if you go and buy, from what I've mentioned, let's say for example a Fender amplifier, that's going to be pretty good at making those Fender sounds. It's going to be the best thing you can get for making those Fender amplifier sounds, but it might not be so great at making sounds of other amplifiers. You go buy a Mesa Boogie, that's one of my favourite brands. Nothing to me sounds like that in terms of the feel you get for playing the metal, the chugging and the intensity of it, but that's not going to be as good as a Fender at playing the Fender sounds. So bear in mind the character of the amplifier if you're going to go out buying one. I'd always say try as many different ones as you can, and see which one sounds great for you. If you're in again talking about, I've done a video in this series about the difference between playing in an original band, playing in a covers band. If you're playing in a band that's original, you're a metal band. Okay, so a Mesa Boogie amp it's probably going to be fine, because a lot of your songs are going to be sounding similar on that type of sound. If you're playing in an American oriented country band, then a Fender is going to be great, because all of your songs are going to be using that type of sound. If you're playing in a covers band and you've got to play a range of different songs, so You might have in your set list, you might have an Ed Sheeran song, a Metallica song, you might have all different types of songs with all different types of sounds you need. Then you might want an amplifier that can do okay at lots of different sounds without being brilliant at just one different sound. So bear in mind what you're going to be using it for, rather than just going for something blindly that's perhaps not going to be great for doing the job. We all make mistakes in terms of purchasing equipment. I've done it. I've been lucky sometimes and got stuff that's been really great for me. There's been a few times where I've bought things that weren't particularly useful to me just because I thought it'd be a good idea without thinking it through fully. So just by sharing that with you, just wanted to make sure that you give it a second thought, read as much as you can about it, and have a look at the reviews about it before you go investing in it. The biggest mistake I probably made, I mentioned Mesa Booger amplifiers before. It's something that I'd aspired to for years and years. They are quite expensive. I couldn't afford one for ages. I reached a point where I could afford one. Went to the music shop and I had my mind set on a 100 watt Mesa Boogie amplifier. The guys in the shop did their best to convince me not to buy it and to buy a 50 watt instead. And they told me that the 100 watt is far too loud for most type of venues, most type of playing. You won't get the best from it. You'll have much better success with the 50, but I knew better. I wanted the 100 watt because it's bigger. And true to form, it was very, very difficult for me to be able to use it to its potential. And I did try, after I bought it, I tried, one of my friends had a 50, I tried the 50, and it would have been so much better if I'd have just took the advice, saved a little bit of money and got the 50. So don't always go for the biggest, bestest one you can get. It's not always the best thing for you. The final thing that I mentioned was another approach to using amplifiers and getting the sounds you want out of amplifiers, and that's something called multi-effects pedals. I was using a multi-effects pedal last time I played in a band. I've got one here. This is this particular one is a Boss multi-effects pedal. It's a ME80, I think it is. Quite an old one. It's not expensive. This thing cost me, it was under 200 quid. I think it was about 170, 180 quid. But what this does is, this doesn't make me any louder, but this allows me to choose a massive range of different amplifier sounds, all kinds of different effects. If you can see, it's got, it probably looks like 4 big foot switches on it. In fact, each one of those is 2, so I've got 8 different foot switches on it. This thing here on this side is a movable pedal that I can use. I can either use it as a volume pedal, I can use it as a wah-wah effect pedal, or I can use it to control all kinds of other different things. And all these little knobs as well I can use to adjust the sound, as though I had a full set of effect pedals on the floor in front of me. So that's not going to make me any louder, but if I was to buy something like that, and you can even get them cheaper than that, you can get them for less than 100 quid, and then get any amplifier that's just going to make me louder. I've got all the features and the foot switches and the gadgetry that I need, plus I've got the volume that I need as well to be able to make that sound come across. So that's a slightly more complicated way of doing it, but sometimes it can be a cheaper way of doing it, and it can give you the results that you need to get. So just a few things for you to have a think about there with amplifiers. This isn't a buyer's guide for amplifiers at all. It's just in the context of, you're going to get involved with a band, what do you need to think about in terms of your amplifier. So whether you go for a 50 watt, 100 watt, whether you go for a valve, whether you go for a transistor amplifier, whether you need to switch sounds or not, whether you need to have different effects that you might want to use or not, or whether you choose to use one of those foot pedal effect boards and just plug it into a straightforward plain sounding amplifier, whichever way you choose to do it, enjoy.